Not every UFC star gets the rub from Uncle Dana right off the bat. For every bone nickel that slides right into the main card of a pay-per-view is a Gilbert Burns who started on the early prelims. Because I have that kind of time, I like to look back at old UFC cards and see which current stars fought on the early prelims. And I'm not talking about prelim fights, I'm talking early prelims that kick off the show. The ones that only the diehards in the audience show up for. The ones that used to be broadcast on Facebook before ESPN Plus was a thing. I've compiled a list of the best UFC fighters to show up on the early prelims. What made this exercise even more challenging was that many fight night cards don't even have early prelims. In addition, some of the older UFC pay-per-views only had one early prelim fight during a time where the roster was more shallow. We're going to take this on an event-by-event basis and just bounce around for fun, so this is in no particular order. However, I will save the best for last. I think you'll be surprised to see how many well-known UFC fighters had to start from the bottom in front of near-empty arenas. The UFC 136 main event is one of the most famous in the company's history, as Frankie Edgar made a remarkable comeback to retain his title against Gray Maynard. What most fans probably don't remember is that a young Stipe Miocic made his UFC debut on the early prelims, scoring a decision victory against Joey Beltran. UFC 200 was naturally stacked from top to bottom, and while the early prelims didn't feature any quote-unquote superstars, it still had 6 household names to any non-casual fan. Jim Miller took on Takanori Gomi, Gegard Mousasi took on Thiago Santos, and Joe Lozon took on Diego Sanchez. All 3 fights ended in KO or TKO, making it a great start to this sort of historic event. Shortly thereafter was UFC 202 McGregor vs Diaz 2. Normally, Conor McGregor events are watered down due to the Irish superstar's ability to sell pay-per-views on his own. With his highly anticipated rematch against Nate Diaz, it was surprising to see how good this card was in retrospect. Kicking off this event was future title challenger Marvin Vettori, followed by Colby Covington, who scored a TKO victory. Yes, you heard me right, a TKO victory for Colby. The Showcase early prelim was a solid matchup between Lorenz Larkin and Neil Magny. UFC 225 Whittaker vs Romero had a rare 4-fight early prelim which featured Anthony Smith and Rashad Evans, granted he was past his prime but still a well-known name, Sergio Pettis vs Joseph Benavidez, future champion Charles Oliveira, and wrapping up the early prelims was perennial ranked featherweight Dan Ige. In the present day, that early prelim would rival some of the uninspiring UFC cards we've had lately. UFC 227 Dillashaw vs Garbrandt 2 featured Zhang Weili and Chito Vera on the undercard. Another Dillashaw title fight, this time against Dominic Cruz, featured Paul Felder and Rob Font on the early prelim. UFC 245 had a Brandon Moreno vs Kai Kara France fight, which had no business being that low on the card. Brandon Moreno became a multiple-time world champion, and Kai Kara France is set to headline his own Fight Night card as of the making of this video. Now let's go way back to UFC 104, where Chael Sonnen headlined the early prelims with a decision victory over future title contender Yushin Okami. Chael would immediately step into a title eliminator fight against Nate Marquardt, and needless to say, his career took off after that. And for the grand finale, UFC on Fox RDA vs Cowboy is the wildest early prelim in history, featuring 3 future UFC champions. Jerking the curtain was a man named Francis Ngannou, who was making his UFC debut. The future heavyweight champion and current face of the PFL scored a second-round KO victory over Luis Henrique. Next up is no slouch in Vicente Luque, who won his prelim bout by submission in the first round. And finally, the early prelim headliner. If you were fortunate enough to arrive at the Amway Center in Orlando, Florida early enough, you can tell your friends you saw 2 future UFC champions square off against each other for the first time. Kamaru Usman defeated Leon Edwards by decision in the first fight of their now famous trilogy way back in December 2015. It was his first fight since winning the Ultimate Fighter Season 21. Usman would go on to win 13 consecutive fights after the Leon victory before succumbing to him nearly 7 years later. The UFC is in a good place talent-wise, and it's no better time to tune into the early prelims to catch the next wave of contenders. Look at UFC 285, which happened just a few months ago. Headlining the early prelims was Ian Gary, who is already ranked at welterweight, and another guy I'm high on in Cameron Simon. Yes, some fighters are destined to stay on the prelims forever, but I think we're entering the next era of MMA fighter where the talent level is even greater than just a few years back. Thank you all for watching. I'm Sean from the Octagon Observer. Please like and subscribe for more.